The morning mist hugged the trenches as Harold Jennings sat up slowly. His blanket was damp, and his boots were frozen solid from the night. Another cold day had begun on the Western Front, just like yesterday. Breakfast was always a repetition of the same. Hard biscuits and bully beef. Harold opened a tin slowly, the smell familiar but never welcome. He carved a notch on the tin's edge, his quiet way of counting time. Tea came from a dented kettle, always strong and slightly burned. It was the only warm thing they had most days. Aside from their coats, Peral sipped in silence, his breath forming slow clouds in the air. Around him, men ate quietly, crouched in the narrow trench walls. No one spoke unless necessary. Silence had become routine. Their only sound was the clink of metal spoons against empty tin. Sergeant Wallace, the trench cook, emerged with a rusted ladle in hand. "Boiled oats," he announced, though it looked more like wet barley. Still, every soldier lined up, grateful for the smallest meal. Harold's scoop was half congealed. By the time he received it, steam rose faintly, curling into the cold like forgotten smoke. He ate it slowly, not for taste, but for something to do. Rats scurried by, bold and fat, from scraps that fell through the duck poo. Even the rats seemed better fed than some of the new recruits. No one even flinched anymore. Rats were part of the scenery. Rations marked time more than clocks or calendars in the trenches. Morning was biscuits and tea. If lucky, evening was often stale bread. Lunch, on good days, was tinned stew or preserved peas. Harold wrote letters to his sister describing better meals than they had. He told her not to worry and said they were eating fine. She didn't need to know. The biscuits broke teeth more than hunger. Winter slowed supply wagons as mud swallowed wheels and boots. Soldiers often went hungry not from war, but from weather. Yet they still received tins, dusty, dented, and years past freshness. Once they were given chocolate, real chocolate wrapped in wax paper. Harold saved his peace for 3 whole days before eating it. That tiny square reminded him of birthdays and warmth. Tea was brewed all day in blackened pots over open flame. They called it trench jar, dark, bitter, and slightly smoky. It wasn't comforting, but it was familiar, and that mattered more. Harold shared his tea with Private Thompson, who'd lost 2 fingers. Thompson never spoke much, but always nodded after every sip. Every week came the rum ration, strictly measured and distributed, just a sip to warm the bones and settle the nerves. It wasn't enough to forget war, but enough to sleep. Toilets were shallow pits dug behind the rear trench wall. Their smell drifted with the wind, mixing with food and smoke. Everything smelled like metal, earth, and rock. Even so, Harold claimed he once smelled cinnamon in the air. He chased it briefly before realizing it was just pipe smoke. Still, he smiled. The imagination was often kinder than truth. He often dreamed of roast dinners and Sunday pies from home. a mashed potatoes, thick gravy, and baked apple dessert. But these dreams were never spoken. They were fragile things. Dreams didn't survive long in the trenches or in the mud. They were buried under silence, ration tins, and worn-out boots. Harold kept his inside, where they couldn't be shelled or spoiled. Sergeant Wallace's trench kitchen was built from scrap and stubbornness. 2 oiled drums, a broken crate, and a bent metal sheet made his stove. Rain leaked through the canvas roof, but it was still called a kitchen. He boiled water every morning before dawn, sometimes with wood, sometimes coal. On lucky days, he added dry onions or army-issued curry powder. Even the blandest food felt warmer when it smelled, just a little different. The stew came in tins, marked McConaughey, meat, carrots, potatoes, and salt. When heated, it was edible. When cold, it stuck to your teeth. Harold once called it muddy soup, and the name stuck for weeks. Dried peas were common too, soaked overnight and boiled into paste. They turned grey and lumpy, but filled your stomach just the same. Soldiers called them green bullets, hard, heavy, and nearly unchewable. When food ran short, stale trench bread was rationed out in slices. It was sour, moist from damp air, and sometimes speckled with mold. Still, no one threw it away, not even a crumb. They sometimes received tins of jam, plum, or apple, sugary and thick. Harold spread it thinly on the biscuits, pretending it was cake. Such tricks helped pass time and keep despair at arm's length. Once, a pigeon dropped dead into the trench, shot by mistake. Wallace skinned it, boiled it, and made pigeon stew for 6 men. It tasted like stringy chicken and courage, and no one complained. Dew's odd meals became stories, quietly passed during long guard shifts. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a ritual, a comfort in the mud and wire. It reminded them of life before war. Supply wagons rarely reached the front lines on time or full. The further you were from headquarters, the less you received. By the time food arrived, it was often damaged or spoiled. Trivers called it the last leg, the hardest part of delivery. Shell craters, collapsed roads, and freezing rain slowed them constantly. Sometimes horses sank to their knees in the sucking trench mud. When nothing arrived, they relied on old stock buried underground. Cans covered in rust, wrapped in burlap, hidden behind sandbags. Harold once ate meat from a tin dated 1909. Food theft was common, not by enemies, but desperate allies. If a man vanished with rations, no one reported it. Hunger made even honest men look the other way. French farmers nearby had long fled their homes and livestock. Bought. Sometimes chickens roamed the edges of no man's land untouched. Harold once chased one, but the Germans shot first. Occasionally, fresh bread would arrive from field ovens in the rear. Warm, soft, and white. It vanished in minutes. Some men cried quietly while chewing it, remembering their mothers. The smell of baking bread drifted through the fog like a dream. It didn't last long, replaced by the scent of damp wool. Still, Harold held on to that scent in his memory. Food was used as reward and punishment by the officers late for duty. Your ration was halved. Help to the cook. You might get extra jam. Every meal was logged in a trench notebook for the record. Harold's job once was to tally rations with frozen fingers. He learned quickly how numbers never filled stomachs. On the worst days, they boiled old boots for broth as a joke. It wasn't funny, but laughter was needed more than true. The broth smelled of leather, but they still pretended to sip. Morning started with steam rising from the trench teapot. The kettle rattled on metal grates made from broken crates. Its sound was the softest music they had in months. The tea was thick and bitter, often overboiled or smoky. Harold Stew drank it slowly, grateful for anything more. The first sip always scalded his tongue and calmed his mind. Dry army biscuits cracked loudly with every bite he took. They were older than some recruits and harder than bone. He softened them in tea. But it didn't help much. Every breakfast felt the same, rushed, quiet, and gray. Men crouched, shoulder to shoulder, chewing and shivering in silence. No one expected variety, just calories to survive the day. Once, someone dropped their biscuit into a puddle by mistake. Pastelated, soggy, gritty, and cold. No one laughed. Food was too precious for jokes. Lunch depended on the day, the weather, and supply wagons. Sometimes stew, sometimes jam, sometimes just more biscuits again. If nothing came, they waited longer, or not at all. On cold days, Harold craved potatoes more than anything else. Boiled, mashed, or even raw, it didn't matter. He just wanted something real beneath his teeth. Makanaki. Stew was common. Meat, carrots, and thick jelly. It smelled like old socks, but filled empty stomachs. Most men ate it without thinking, barely tasting anything at all. The cook sometimes added herbs he found near the trench wall. They didn't change the taste, but the smell seemed nicer. Sergeant Wallace said, "A little green gives hope." Rain ruined everything. Food, boots, letters, and even nothing stayed dry. Not even your spoon or your rations. Soup and socks shared the same soggy texture. When a loaf of fresh bread arrived, men went quiet. They passed it hand to hand, reverently, like treasure. Its warmth reminded them of kitchens, fireplaces, and home. Tinned pitchers were the rarest prize a man could get. Golden, syrupy, and soft, they tasted like another world. Harold once cried while eating his spoon shaking slightly. Cigarettes and chocolate were traded like gold among squatters. One bar could buy you a gem, 2 bars of favor. Sugar gave more comfort than even the thickest coat. Harold kept a list in his pocket of foods he missed. Roast beef, shepherd's pie, apple crumble with warm custard. He read it before bed, like a prayer in the mud. At night, as frost formed on helmets and sleeves, he dreamed, full lamplight, of plates too full to carry. He held on to that warmth, even when everything else felt cold. Harold once found a mint sweet at the bottom of his coat. It was fuzzy with lint, but still smelled like home. He cleaned it gently and sucked it slow for hours. Small surprises like that felt like fortune in the trenches. Even one sweet could lift a man's whole afternoon. They weren't greedy, just starving for something familiar. A Scottish soldier once shared a biscuit shaped like a thistle. His sister had sent it with a note in Gaelic. Harold didn't understand the words, but he understood the kindness. Thompson spoke often of pork pies from his uncle's shop. He described the thick crust, jelly inside, and spiced meat. His voice soft when he spoke about the smell. They spoke more about gravy than gunfire. Food became the only past they truly missed. One soldier remembered cheese toast from his school canteen. Another missed dumplings his grandmother made on cold nights. Everyone remembered something warm, soft, and perfectly ordinary. The trench diet stripped the color from every meal. Everything was brown, beige gray. Nothing ever green or red. Even jam seemed faded by the time it reached them. A parcel once arrived with dried apples from a mother. Viva leathery, slightly sweet, and passed around carefully. Everyone got one piece, and no one argued about it. Some men saved parts of their rations for letters home. Crumbs, wrappers, even empty tins were sent to families. They wanted to show what dinner meant in a trench. Once, a soldier received a fruitcake wrapped in wax cloth. It was hard as brick, but smelled of cinnamon and raisins. They broke it into pieces using a bayonet. On Christmas, the rations came with an extra scoop of jam. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. Even the officers seemed slightly more human that day. Harold scribbled down everything he ate in a little notebook, not out of interest, but just to track the pattern. It never changed, but writing it helped pass time. He sometimes drew food in the margins, adding fake colors. A roast chicken in gold ink, peas in bright green. It was his own secret cookbook of things they never had. The worst days were the ones without any delivery. No food, no word, no smoke from Wallace's kitchen. Those days felt longer than the calendar allowed. In those moments, hunger didn't grow. It just settled in. It became part of the body, like bone or breath. No man complained. They just sat still and waited. They learned to eat in silence and finish without waste. No leftovers, no seconds, no regrets. Food was function, not pleasure. Until they remembered. Memory made meals more real than tin ever could. One imagined meal could fill a man better than hash. In their heads, they ate better than kings every night. Evening fell slowly in the trenches, like a curtain pulled by hand. The light faded behind fog and barbed wire, soft and pale, Shadows stretched across the dugout walls like sleepy soldiers. Dinner, if it came, was handed out in dented pots. There was no table, no warmth, no real place to sit. They crouched in corners and ate wherever mud allowed. Sometimes the stew was warm, sometimes half frozen, sometimes gone. No one asked questions. If you were fed, you were lucky. Aye, even a spoonful of heat felt like mercy. Harold stirred his tin slowly, watching grease swirl on top. Bits of meat, barely recognizable, floated like ghostly shapes. He didn't chew much anymore. He just swallowed. There were no flavors, just textures. Soft, tough, or watery. A bite of potato was like finding treasure in the tin. He sometimes saved it for last, as a final comfort. Nobody asked for more, even when they were starving. Asking was pointless. There was never enough. And yet, they always hoped someone had saved a little extra. Sharing was unspoken, quiet, and without drama. One man would break his biscuit in two without a word. The other would nod, and the moment would pass. Sergeant Wallace, despite his rough ways, always served the sick first. He grumbled as he did it, but never skipped a man. Even kindness had to be disguised as routine. By now, Harold could eat with his eyes closed. His hands knew the mess tin's shape, the spoon's edge. Eating had become habit, not hunger. Some nights, someone sang softly while chewing, lullabies or hymns. Not loud, just the thread of sound through the damp air. It always stopped when the gun started again. Once, a German voice sang across no man's land, a slow song carried by mist and distance. Harold listened until it vanished beneath distant fire. Even under the worst conditions, men found ways to sit together, bathe. They leaned shoulder to shoulder, sharing silence and warmth. They didn't need conversation, just presence. Harold missed the sound of plates, of knives on porcelain, even a creak of a chair under a dining table. Poof. The trench was too still, too quiet, in a different way. He tried once to describe the taste of stew in a letter. He stopped halfway through. There were no words for it, only comparisons to wet rope and cold salt. The letters always asked, "Are they feeding you well?" He always lied and said, "It's not bad, really." Mothers didn't need the truth. Not this truth. Sometimes food arrived in the dark, thrown from a supply cart. Men scrambled quietly, feeling for tins in the mud. If you found one, you kept it or shared it. In sleep, Harold dreamed of sandwiches, not fancy ones, just bread, cheese, and maybe tomato, eaten in a sunlit field. That dream always faded with the morning whistle. In the trenches, food wasn't just survival, it was trade. A spoon of jam could buy a cigarette or a dry sock. Men bartered quietly, without pride, under the cover of fog. Harold once traded half his biscuit for a page from a newspaper. It didn't matter what it said. It just looked like home. The paper smelled faintly of ink, and that was enough. Chocolate was the highest currency. A single square, pure gold. If you had a bar, you had power for a day. Harold once shared his without asking anything in return. He never forgot the look on the man's face. Surprised. Kindness was rare when hunger curled tight in every belly. Sometimes it felt like a rebellion just to be generous. Jam tins were hoarded, like treasure, and eaten in secret. Men dug holes to hide them from rats. And sometimes, friends. Trust was thin when food was low. Salt was another rare thing, craved more than sugar. A pinch could transform the bland stew into something tolerable. They joked salt was worth more than silver out here. A soldier named Clark once found a lemon in a parcel. He sliced it slowly and passed it around, bite by bite. Each face puckered, but every man smiled after. There were always rumors about officers eating better behind the lines. Warm meals, fresh eggs, even real butter. Just stories, maybe, but they fed the imagination more than any stew could. Sometimes they got cocoa powder in rations, dry and chalky. Wallace mixed it with water and called it pudding. It wasn't, but it reminded them of something that was. The cleverest cooks scrounged together trench recipes from scraps. Stewed bread, mashed tinned beans, sweetened biscuits with jam. Billy called them frontline desserts and ate them with grins. Harold once made toast by laying bread on a hot shovel. It smoked, turned black, and crackled loudly. He still ate it with pride. It felt like cooking. Men remembered their childhood favorites when rations ran thin. One recited his mother's meatloaf recipe word for word. It was like prayer, and everyone listened quiet. Canned meat lost its label, but never its smell. Each brand had its own stink. Harold could tell them apart. One always reminded him of wet pennies and oil. There was no such thing as picky eating anymore. If it didn't move, they ate it by. And sometimes, even if it did, mice were caught and roasted, bones and all. No one bragged about it. It was just necessity. Pride faded faster than flavor. Harold once shared his biscuit with a man who'd just arrived. The man smiled and whispered, "First bite out here." Harold nodded. "Choose luck. It's not getting better." Sometimes they ate in the dark, unable to see the food. It helped. Taste mattered less when your eyes stayed closed. Blind meals were easier on the spirit being. The food in the trenches never filled the body fully, but a shared bite often filled something deeper inside, something that kept the men going, one mouthful at a time. Winter in the trenches brought more than just cold. It froze rations, stiffened hands, and silenced appetite. Even opening a tin felt like a struggle against nature. Hot food became a memory instead of a routine. By the time it reached the men, it was ice they chewed fast before their jaws went numb. Harold wrapped his tin in cloth and held it under his coat. Body heat helped warm it slightly, just enough to eat. Even lukewarm stew felt like a luxury that month. Ration deliveries came slower in snow-covered terrain. Horses slept. Wheels bones cracked and paths disappeared. Sometimes they waited 3 days for anything edible. Wallace once cooked using snow instead of water. The stew was thinner, colder, and lasted longer. The men thanked him anyway. No one blamed him. Spring brought new problems with the thawing ground. Mud returned in waves, thick and ankle-deep. Food moved faster again, slightly better, slightly more. With spring came occasional grains, wild herbs and weed. Men picked them from trench edges and added to soup. It gave flavor and the illusion of freshness. Summer spoiled rations faster than winter froze them. Cans exploded from heat or rusted from damp. Flies gathered before the lids even came off. Bread molded in hours, turning blue or black. Still, they scraped off the top and ate the rest. Wasting food was a sin no one dared commit. Autumn came with its own smell. Wet leaves, old fire. It was quieter, calmer, and more thoughtful somehow. Harold missed apples most in autumn, crisp, red, and cold. The changing seasons didn't change the meals much, but they changed how the men talked while eating. Cold made them quiet. Warmth brought out laughter. Each Caesared reminded them of home in different ways. Winter meant stew by the fireplace, boots by the door. Summer meant lemonade sandwiches and bare feet on grass. Herod once described seasons using only food. Winter tastes like salt. Spring tastes like herbs. Summer is sweet. Autumn is smoky. The rats changed with the seasons too. Fat in summer. They stole biscuits, licked jam tins, and nibbled socks. One soldier swore a rat ran off with his sandwich. Sometimes the men set traps using scraps of stew. They caught more rats than they caught sleep. But even the rats learned quickly to avoid being. When food was low and spirits lower, time moved differently. The hours between meals felt longer than the rest. They stared at empty tins, hoping they'd refuel themselves. Through seasons of scarcity and spoilage, they kept not for pleasure, rarely for fullness, just to carry on. One bite, one spoon, one more step through the year. The hunger never truly went away in the trenches. Even after a meal, it sat quietly inside them. It wasn't pain, it was emptiness without complaint. Harold often rubbed his stomach without knowing it, a habit now, like blinking or breathing. It reminded him that he was still alive. Some soldiers claimed they didn't feel hunger anymore. They said their bodies had adapted to the trench diet. But Harold knew better. It just became quieter. The mind adjusted faster than the stomach ever could. Men dreamed of food more than they dreamed of peace. Even nightmares had roast dinners hidden in the corners. Thompson once said he dreamed of butter. Nothing else. Just butter spread thick on a warm slice of bread. He smiled the whole day after telling that dream. The cook once served a stew that smelled like real meat. Men gather close, sniffing like children before a feast. It turned out to be horse. No one minded. There were stories of men who ate candle wax, soft, tasteless, but it fooled the belly for a while. Harold never tried it, but he understood the urge. They chewed tobacco when food was delayed too long. It made them dizzy, sick, but momentarily full. The body confused survival with discomfort. One man boiled a sock just to feel warm food. He didn't eat it, just held the steam close. They called it sock soup, half joke, half desperation. Some saved crumbs in their pockets, just in case. A private named Miller kept biscuit dust in a pouch. He never used it. It was just security. The hunger was heavier at night when the wind blew. No distractions, no noise, just stomach and silence. Harold would hum quietly to push the feeling away. Once, someone received dried bananas in a parcel. He ate them slowly, one bite per hour. Then he cried, quietly, behind his hands. Nobody teased him. They all understood. Sometimes the smallest sweetness broke the strongest man. The front didn't leave room for shame. Food was no longer about taste or joy. It was about memory, survival, and something to look forward to. Even bad stew gave a reason to wait. Harold imagined roast chicken with rosemary and lemon. How? He pictured mashed potatoes with melted butter dripping slowly. It helped him sleep more than the rum ever did. Rations were often late, but hope was always early. They always expected something better with the next crate. Hope was the only thing they had in bulk. The hunger in war was patient, quiet, and constant. It was never gone, only ignored. Harold called it the ghost that dines with us all. When the war ended, the trenches emptied one by one. Men walked out, carrying more silence than noise. Their boots were lighter, but their memories remained full. Harold stepped over the trench wall without a goodbye. There was no ceremony, no flag, no song, just a deep breath and a long, slow exhale. He carried a mess tin in his bag, dented and black. P kept it, not for use, but for memory. It had held every bite that helped him survive. Back home, food came in warm kitchens and crowded tables. He was offered roast beef, gravy, and fresh bread. But Harold ate quietly, slower than the others. The taste was rich, overwhelming, almost too much. His body wanted it, but his mind hesitated. Flavor now felt like something unfamiliar. At breakfast, he stirred sugar into his tea again. He hadn't done that in years, not even once. The sweetness made him tear up without warning. He sometimes missed the bitter trench. Tea, thick and grey, not because it was better, but because it meant company, silence, shared, steam rising, mugs clinking, simple comforts in care. He told no stories of hunger, no tales of stew. When asked, he'd nod and say, "We managed." The truth felt too heavy to explain properly. At night, he kept a biscuit in a drawer nearby. Just one, wrapped in paper, untouched for months. It made him feel safe in some quiet, odd way. He once tried McConaughey again, out of curiosity. The smell was the same, but the meaning had changed. He didn't finish it. Food in peace was full of color, sound, and comfort. But Harold always ate, like he was still rationing. One bite, pause, another, always making it last. His family didn't understand why he saved crusts, or why he flinched when soup boiled over suddenly. They didn't need to understand. He was just glad to be home. In spring, he planted potatoes behind the cottage. He watched them grow with quiet pride each day. To him, they weren't just food, they were peace. He cooked simply, the way Wallace had taught him. Boil slow, stir steady, serve warm, waste nothing. Even in peace, trench habits stayed close. He missed the men more than he missed the meals, the shared silence, the trading of jam, the shoulder nods. They had eaten hunger together, and that bond held. Letters still came from Thompson, always signed with a drawing, usually a steaming cup or a biscuit with a smile. Harrod kept them all in a wooden box under his bed. Every year, on the war's end date, he made stew. Just onions, carrots, and potatoes in a battered pot. He ate it in silence, with a chipped metal spoon. To outsiders, it was a plain meal, almost sad. But to Harold, it was memory, survival, and thanks. Not to the food, but to those who shared it. Years passed, but Harold still ate with care and quiet. Each meal felt like a small ceremony of memory, not of war, but of surviving it. He never piled his plate high, never rushed to wine. Even at parties, he'd choose the simplest dish. His eyes always searched for stew and bread. P kept a shelf of old ration tins in his shed, cleaned, empty, neatly stacked, useless, but full of meaning. Visitors often asked, why these? He never answered. One tin still had a dent from a trench wall. Another was burned black from a shell fire stir. Two, Harold. Each was a chapter he couldn't explain aloud. His garden grew rows of potatoes, carrots, onions, herbs. He picked them slowly, whispering names like old friends. Just enough for stew, he'd always say. Cooking was quiet. No radio, no noise, no help. He'd stir slowly, lid tilted, steam curling like memory. Every movement learnt from the trench kitchen long ago. Sometimes he'd eat alone with a photo on the table. A group of men in muddy coats, all smiling faintly. He never told anyone who they were. P once baked trench bread for a local history day. People laughed politely, called it interesting. B smiled too, but only from the outside. Hunger had shaped him, not in size, but in silence. He could still hear the stomach growls from those cold nights. Be still feel the biscuit crack like bone in his hand. Once, a young man asked him about his service. What was it like? Harold paused and stirred his tea. We were always waiting, he said, mostly for food. He donated his uniform to the museum, but not his spoon. Bought that stayed with him. Warm, scratched, oddly comforting. He kept it wrapped in a cloth, in a drawer. B. He often visited the war memorial. Always early, always alone. he'd place a poppy and a small biscuit at the base. No one else did that, but it felt right to him. In his journal, he never wrote about gunfire or wounds. Only food, what was served, when it came, who shared it. He called it the real diary of war. His family knew he'd been through something vast and silent. This sort in how he salted his soup carefully, or how he'd hum while washing a single spoon. Parrell taught his granddaughter how to boil a perfect potato. She asked, "Why no seasoning?" He replied, "Because once we had none." Sometimes, when no one was looking, he chewed slowly, eyes closed, spoon resting in hand. Not to taste, but to remember. Every meal reminded him of someone lost. A name, a laugh, a cold morning with hot tea. He ate with ghosts more often than with people. He never called himself brave, never claimed to be strong. He just said, "I showed up and I ate what came." That, for him, was enough. In his final years, he still kept one jam tin. Unopened, dusty, slightly dented, labeled plum and apple. It sat on the shelf like a friend who stayed. The war had ended long ago. But its flavor, bitter, bland, and sometimes sweet, remained. And Harold quietly remembered it all through every bite. In the final years of his life, Harold cooked less. Not because he was tired, but because memory did the work. Some meals only needed to be imagined, to be felt. Kitchen stayed clean, with one pot always ready. A tin ladle hung above the stove, never dusty. He said it made the place feel willing to feed. Neighbors sometimes brought soup, bread, or sponge cakes. He thanked them, ate slowly, always left a little behind. Not from manners, but habit built in hunger. Even in comfort, he measured food carefully. One slice of bread, never too. One cup of tea, not filled to the top. His pantry was small, but organized, like a supply box. Tins of beans, flour, salt, and old army men. He didn't need them, but they belonged there. Children would visit, laugh, and ask about war, food. He'd let them taste his trench stew, mild and thick. They'd make faces, and he would chuckle softly. He once held a tin and whispered, "You've no idea," not to anyone, just to the tin itself. Like it, remembered too, in its quiet rust. He walked slower now, but his garden still grew. Every spring, potatoes came up in perfect lines. He never called them crops, just companions. The local school invited him to speak one winter. He brought a biscuit and messed instead of medals. They fed me more than the war did, he said. He never liked ceremonies or fancy dinners. Once he left a banquet after tasting the soup. "It's too good," he smiled. "It doesn't belong." He wrote one final letter to Thompson before passing. Short and neat. Saved one last biscuit. You'd be proud. Peas sealed it with a tea bag inside. That winter, Harold didn't wake one morning. He lay peacefully, spoon in hand, blanket tucked neat on the table, one slice of bread and empty mug. The town buried him beside the old churchyard hill. Not many came, but someone brought a stewpan. They left it by the grave, still warm. People spoke kindly of him, but briefly. Quiet, not cooked, strange food, grew fine. Potato, that was enough, he would have agreed. His house remained untouched for weeks. Inside, the tin collection still lined the shelf and on the windowsill. One untouched jam tin. The museum requested his notebook and mess tin by. They placed them in glass, labeled simply Trench Survivor. The cook who remembered. Visitors walked past it without stopping. Sometimes by. The smell of metal and old paper lingered faintly. Some said it made them oddly hungry. The world moved on, full of flavor and color. But the memory of hunger still walked softly behind it, carried by men like Harold, now gone. And somewhere, beneath earth and time, he still stirs the pot, still adds salt carefully, still chews slowly, still remembers every bite, every friend, every silence. After Harold passed, the house sat silent through winter. Wind rattled the shutters, and the kettle stayed cold. The scent of broth seemed to linger. Anyway, his granddaughter, Elsie, eventually unlocked the old cottage door. Poof! She stepped softly, as if not to wake something. Dust floated like smoke in the early sunlight. The mess tin still sat on the shelf untouched. The biscuit he'd saved was hard as stone. She didn't throw it away. She wrapped it in linen. The notebook was there too, full of faded lines, ration, records, food, sketches, and a list of names. She read them aloud, one by one, without knowing why. In the back was a recipe labeled trench stew, potatoes, onions, water, and thyme. No seasoning, just silence stirred in. Elsie lit the stove as he once did. Hot, clicked, gently, heat rising, slow. She cooked it, just like he had shown her. The stew was bland, warm, and deeply quiet. She ate alone at his old table, and for the first time, she understood him. She didn't change the recipe or add herbs. She kept it plain, heavy, and honest, because that was how he had lived before visitors came. Asking what kind of man Harold was, she would smile and say he fed people. Nothing more needed to say. She kept the garden going just as he did. Potatoes in perfect lines, carrots tucked beneath soil. It felt like keeping him alive, root by root, by each year. On the day he passed, she cooked a bowl of stew, a slice of dry bread, and she'd leave them outside on the bench. Once, a neighbor asked if she talked to him. She said, "No, but I listen while I eat." And then she smiled softly at her spoon. The museum offered to take more of his items, but she declined. They're still doing work here. The mess tin wasn't ready to retire yet. Children visited on field trips, expecting medals and tailing. Instead, they left with biscuit crumbs and quiet wonder. History told through pots instead of parade. She added nothing modern to the house kitchen. No microwave, no blender, no noise. Only the stove, the kettle, and the creaking chair. Years later, Elsie passed on the recipe to her son. He didn't fully understand it, but followed it closely. He said, "This tastes like something remembered." The stew became a family ritual, shared in silence, a meal made of history, not hunger, of presence, not flavor. And long after Harold's name was forgotten by strangers, his meal remained, simmering in quiet homes. A taste of a war that refused to shout. Harold's great-grandson, Leo, grew up hearing stew stories, not about battles, just about potatoes, biscuits, and cold tea. To him, food was how the past whispered. He didn't know war, but he knew the mess tin. It sat on the mantel, quiet and blackened with age. It looked like an ordinary pan, but wasn't. He once asked his mother why Harold had eaten in silence. She said, because sometimes food was the only voice. Leo didn't fully understand, not yet. In school, other children brought colorful lunches and fizzy drinks. Leo brought thick bread, boiled eggs, and a small tin. Some teased him, but he smiled just the same. One day, he brought stew for lunch in Harold's recipe. No spices, just root vegetables and a pinch of salt. A teacher tasted it and blinked, slowly, surprised. She asked, "Why this?" And he replied, "It's who we are." She didn't ask again, but nodded with respect. Sometimes the simplest answers were the deepest. At home, Leo learned to cook it alone. He chopped quietly, stirred slowly, and cleaned as he went. The kitchen always smelled faintly of steam and memory. He didn't know the faces in Harold's notebook, but he read every name, every date, every note. They became part of the meal, too. As he grew older, Leo wrote down his own version. Same ingredients, but he added new notes. Eat with care, chew slow. Always share the first spoon. His friends eventually asked him to cook for them. He served stew in small bowls with flat biscuits. No one laughed. They listened as they chewed. One friend said, "It's like the past is sitting here." Leo smiled and replied, "It never really left," and no one argued. Years passed, and Leo opened a quiet cafe. No music, no rush, just wooden chairs and soft lighting. He called it Harold's Table. The menu was short. Stew, tea, hard bread, jam. Each dish had a story printed beneath it. People came, not for flavor, but for stillness. He kept the mess tin in a glass case on the counter. A small plaque reeked this fed a memory. Priest. Some touched the glass gently before ordering. Sometimes veterans visited and sat in silence. They didn't say much, but ate everything. Leo always nodded with quiet understanding. The cafe became more than food. It became memory, a space for reflection, warmth, and quiet chewing, where every bite honored the ones who ate before. And through it all, Harold's stew stayed the same, passed from trench to kitchen to table, a recipe that time couldn't forget. Leo started writing a new notebook beside the till, not about money, but about moments shared with Stu. He titled it Meals Without Words. He wrote in it between customers and after cleanup. Not every day, just when something felt worth recording. Sometimes a biscuit meant more than a whole story. One entry read, "Girls smiled after first bite, stayed longer." Another simply said, "Two old men nodded, then cried." Each line a snapshot, soft as steam on glass. He began offering customers a chance to write too. He left a small box labeled "Remember Something." Some wrote memory, others left drawings or names. One note read, "This stew tastes like my father's jacket." Another said, "This tea is quieter than my grief." Leo never asked questions. He just folded them gently. He kept the notes in a wooden drawer below the counter. Never sorted, never discarded. He believed every memory deserved its space. One cold evening, a teacher brought her whole class. They sat in silence, chewing slowly, notebooks in hand. Afterward, they drew pictures of spoons and stove. Leo added a new dish to the menu, trench toast. It was just bread dry fried on a hot pan. He served it with butter and a quiet smile. Some customers asked for seasoning or extras. He always gave them what they wanted, but softly reminded. This version saved lives before it pleased Tom. He began holding a still supper every month. No talking, no music, just slow, shared eating. People signed up weeks in advance. At one supper, someone left a medal on the table. Leo didn't ask whose it was. He just placed it beside Harold's mess tin for the night. He once found a child writing in the memory box. The paper said, "My grandpa used to hum when cooking." Leo folded it and added it to the drawer. The cafe became a place. People came to pause, not to be fed, but to remember feeding others, and to honor hunger that once waited quietly. Leo sometimes closed early when it rained. P said the stew tasted better when it cooked in silence, and rain made everything feel honest. One afternoon, he made bread from scratch without a recipe. It came out uneven, burnt at the edges. P served it anyway, and it was gone by closing. No meal went to waste, not even crumbs. He always said, "Someone once prayed for this biscuit." Bye. And people listened more than they expected to. Years passed, and Harold's cafe slowly grew quiet. Not from lack of love, but gentle aging. The world outside grew louder, but inside stayed still. Leo, now older, kept the stove burning each morning. His hands moved slower, but his heart remained steady. He still stirred the stew like a prayer. People came not for food, but for memory. We sat in silence, listened to the spoon. Even in stillness, the cafe spoke gently. One spring, Leo knew it was time to stop. Not because of weariness, but because it felt right. Every legacy, even quiet ones, needs rest. He's cooked one final pot, slow, soft, careful. Potatoes, onions, water, a pinch of salt. Steam rose like memory curling into the air. He set one bowl at every table, just in case. Each place a tribute, each spoon a whisper. No names were spoken, only remembered. Before closing, he placed Harold's tin in the window, beside a biscuit wrapped in faded cloth. The sunlight touched it like an old friend. He sat at the same table where Harold once sat. Bill held his spoon the same way, steady and quiet, and ate every bite, eyes closed. Outside, birds sang as if nothing was ending. Inside, the last stew cooled slowly in its pot, but it felt full, not empty. Leo wrote one final entry in the memory book. Today, I ate for everyone who once waited. Then closed the notebook gently with both hands. A neighbor offered to buy the cafe and keep it. Leo shook his head. Let it rest now. It had served more than meals. It served peace. That evening, he packed away the old photographs. P left one behind. Harold in the trench, smiling. No caption, just steam in the background. He took down the sign that read Harold's table, folded it neatly, placed it in the garden. There, potatoes still bloomed, quiet and faithful. He boiled water for tea, one final time. Sipped slowly, alone, but not lonely. He was surrounded by every silence ever shared. When he locked the door, he didn't turn back, not out of coldness, but contentment. Place had given all it could. He walked home with a steady step, no rush. The spoon still warm in his pocket. It was the last one he'd ever carried. That night, he'd dreamed of the trench again. But this time, it was bright, dry, and warm. And Harold was there, stirring gently. No words were spoken, only the sound of stew. No hunger, no fear, just full bowls and peace. The way it always should have been.